I think I'm going to get started here. Thanks for everyone to coming. My name is David Weiner. I'm the Deputy Chancellor in New York City Department of Education, and it's been great coming out here. I live in New York, although I lived in California for 7 years, and just walking around today reminds me about I made a huge mistake moving back to the East Coast. It is, absolutely gorgeous out here, and it's going to be like this for the next 3 months in California. So just can only live with regrets at this point. Anyway, we're going to talk a little bit about the iZone, and I actually, when I talked to Adam about it, he said maybe talk a little bit about where we started and how we got here. So I'm going to do a little bit of that, and we're actually very fortunate today that Arthur Vanderveer is actually one of the architects of the New York City iZone. I think you started when it was you and maybe one or two other people. This was just basically a concept, and it has now grown to a place where we have about 260 schools, about 85,000 students, about 5,000 teachers, actually more than that, about 7,000 teachers involved. So Arthur here is going to have the liberty to correct me and say anything that I'm saying that's wrong. And as we talk about it, I'm also going to try to make this as interactive as possible. Maybe I'll spend about 10 minutes about talking about some of where we've come from. And then the other big thing that we wanted to talk about is a lot of the challenges that we've had along the way. Obviously, we just sit here and give a PowerPoint about how wonderful and great the iZone is, and I do think it's wonderful and great, but obviously we have major challenges. It's harder to learn that way and to figure out okay, New York City made some mistakes going in this direction, and we're going to recommend you go in other directions. So I'm really going to try my best to talk about that. And I know quite a few people in this room are also some of the partners that we have here in New York. So if anybody wants to talk about some of the positive or negative experiences you've had with our work, I'd love to have everyone weigh in. We definitely have not figured it out in New York. We think we've got some good ideas, and it seems to be playing out in some schools and in some environments. And then in other places, it's not working out as well as we had hoped. And we're trying to figure out why that's worked out really well in some places and not as well in other places. So that's kind of where I want to start. So anyway, as the three superintendents who were in this room before described, you have to some degree, make the case for change. Why do we need to move from our previous structure to a new structure? This is very small and hard to read, but essentially you can see our graduation rates, which is the orange bar at the top. This is like a 4-year cohort graduation rate. The blue rates, which is essentially college-ready, students achieving college-ready on Regents exams, and then in math, and then in English is the green bottom chart. And you can see generally we have made some incremental progress in New York. About just 6 or 7 years ago, we were really only graduating about 46% of students in New York City. It was literally one of the probably bottom 5 worst school districts in terms of achievement or cohort graduation rates in the country. We're at 65%, which is great, and we're happy we've gained 18, 19, 20 percentage points over 5 years, but it is obviously nowhere near where we need to be. And if we can get 19 points in 6 years, it means we need about another 60 years to get all of our students graduating on time. And that's really not an acceptable level of improvement. And the iZone basically was formed with this idea that although it's great we're making incremental improvements, we need to figure out some ways to make some dramatic improvements at our schools at a much rapider rate. And so that's essentially what we're trying to do. Didn't realize this was the next slide, but generally we're looking at radical growth requires radical change, and that's what essentially we're looking at doing. And you can kind of see why we formed the iZone, and this was essentially our mission from the get-go. So we essentially saw New York City public schools, and I would argue that probably a lot of schools and districts around the country. In this model on the left-hand side, we try to use a lot of graphics here, in which basically we had structures and curriculum and staff and programs, and they were created, and students were essentially going through that kind of system. Teachers had a role, students revolved around them. There was schedules in place, and students revolved around that. You kind of had to go to school, 8:30 to 3:30. You went through a 5-period day. You were in first grade when you were 6 years old, and you were in 7th grade when you were 13 years old, and you were in 12th grade when you were 18 years old. And that's essentially the structure that existed. And I would argue actually it still probably exists in most schools today. And essentially our vision was this idea that we needed to actually look at the student and start rethinking the structures. We didn't start with the idea that technology was really the answer. We really looked at it as spaces and classroom design, curriculum assessment and pacing, staff and student roles, and programs and schedules. And technology was essentially avenue to speed our change in these areas. And I'll talk a little bit more about what that means. But we didn't really see technology as the answer. We also do not have one model. If you decide to come to New York in March, you will come see, we're going to go visit some iZone schools, some of the ones that are me in this presentation. They all look very different. There's not one model. There's not like we took and gave iPads to every single elementary school student and laptops to every middle school student and desktops to every high school student. We didn't go with that model. We essentially gave schools money and said, think about your programs, your policies, your schedules, your structures, and determine how extra money can help you change some of those things. Technology might be a use, and some schools have taken and moved to a fully iPad environment for every one of their students. And some schools have not done that. They've gone in other directions, which we'll talk again a little bit about here. So that's kind of where our strategy is. And this kind of fits with our New York City model. There are two driving cultures that have existed in New York City for about the last decade. One is this concept of accountability, that we hold schools accountable for their results, and that the school community, as long as they're achieving results, can continue to move forward. And schools that are not achieving results, we're going to essentially put in either interventions and, at the last resort, close down the schools. The other piece is autonomy, that we're going to define what we expect schools to do, and we're going to hold that pretty hard. But the way that schools achieve that is really up to them to make that determination. So we provide supports and structures to help schools that aren't able to do it, but generally, we've really pushed this concept of autonomy. I was actually a principal in New York for 4 years. I was actually principal under the old system where it was a district structure where we had 26 districts, and it was a very top-down management model. I felt like middle management. I really did. I listened to what my superintendent said, and I tried to implement it. And then I was actually, during the period of time where we switched from a district or regional structure into what we called the empowerment school zone. And essentially, during the 2 years where I was empowerment school principal, I actually didn't see my superintendent for 2 years. My school got an A on the progress report. We were one of the highest rated schools, although, again, in New York City, we base a lot on growth, not on static performance. But we had a lot of growth in my school, so we scored very well. And again, I didn't see my superintendent for 2 years. Essentially, the accountability system said this school is being successful, and however you're getting that levels of success, we're okay with it. You're hitting the targets that we set for you, and we have allowed schools to do that. And as you'll see, that's actually, we struggle a little bit around innovation and autonomy, that those two sometimes concepts, and actually accountability and autonomy, can sometimes be in contrast to one another, but we'll talk a little bit about that. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how we got to this concept of the iZone. And again, Arthur, I'd love for you to weigh in here if you want to add more rich details from this. But essentially, about 5 or 6 years ago, Joel Klein was the chancellor in New York City, and we started running some pilots that were going on. And probably the most famous pilot that New York City runs is what we call School of One. It's a model that does middle school curriculum. If you Google School of One, there's about 40,000 articles out there that have been written about it. But essentially, School of One was one of multiple pilots we had going on. Another one we had was called a time and staffing pilot, which essentially helped schools before there was an iZone to think about things differently. We made a determination at that point, and that we've really replicated moving forward, that New York City as a system can actually not innovate as fast as the marketplace can. And at the time, and actually people in this room I'm sure could argue to this day, New York City was not a very friendly place to vendors and partners coming in and getting direct access to schools and helping them to innovate. And so our time and staffing pilot and then the iZone was essentially a place where we said we need to bring in outside partners so that they can help our schools get faster levels of growth and change. And that was one of the big things that started in time of staffing. This eventually rolled into what we call the iZone 360, which is essentially a whole school redesign process. We have about 50 schools or so that are in it, and essentially they're doing a whole school redesign. They're saying, around those concepts I said in the beginning, we're not just going to do a little segment of our school, we have to do whole school redesign in order to make this school more effective. So that's kind of the first part of the iZone. We just finished our first year of implementation. Schools just went through their first year. iZone 360 schools essentially have to create a 3-year plan and show dramatic improvements within 3 years, or we move them out of iZone 360 because they're not making the growth and they're not hitting the expectations. Our hope has been, and actually this has somewhat come true, that by supporting school through whole school redesign, we'd be able to see more rapid change, be able to figure out which are the best structures to kind of move forward. So all of the schools look a little bit different in how they look like it. The other thing that mentioned here also is the iZone 360 is only 6 through 12 schools. It's only middle schools and high schools. And I can get into why we started with that structure, but essentially that's iZone 360. The next one we started was an online and blended learning pilot. I think this was about 40 schools about 3 or 4 years ago. And this was basically to try to figure out if we could, New York City was kind of in the dark ages when it came to online and blended learning. And so we essentially wanted to do some rapid move towards online and blended learning. There are some obvious places in New York City where online and blended learning works really well. We have a lot of students who are in hospitalizational environments, students that are going through pregnancy, issues and cancer scares and chemotherapy and those kind of things. Getting them on online and blended learning, I mean, these kids are in the hospital. Everyone supports that. No one argues against that. At some of our juvenile detention center schools, Rikers Island, for example, everyone supports putting those kids on online learning because they're not really getting a great education because of their situation. We have actually tried to move this more towards the mainstream. The average school in New York City, we think, needs some of this work. And so that has actually been a big shift. We have about 200 schools that are in this iLearn New York City, which is essentially our online and blended learning platform. We have actually Brooklyn Tech, which is one of the top 100 highest performing high schools in the country, is involved in one of our iLearn schools, and they've got about 3,000 students, or maybe less, about 1,000 classes that students are taking online. Some of the kids may be taking more than one, but essentially 1,000 different classes. We have some of our lowest performing schools, are literally closing schools that are phasing out because they're so low performing. They're also involved in it. So we have schools at all ends of the spectrum in this. This is the second one. iZone 360, iLearn New York City, kind of covered some of it. And then our final one is Innovate New York City. This again started, School of One is in Innovate New York City. This is essentially a catch-all for all of the rest of schools that are doing innovative things. School of One was at one school, and now it's actually at 5 schools and potentially expanding more rapidly out there. New American Academy, which is a school that has changed the career ladder structure for school teachers. So there's actually one classroom with about 60 kids and 4 teachers, ranging from a master teacher who makes about $125,000 a year to a beginning teacher who makes about $50,000 a year, and we've really changed the salary structure. But these essentially have moved into this catch-all that we call Innovate New York City. So the iZone essentially made up of these 3 groups. There are about 265 schools now in these 3 groups that are going through this. And that's essentially where we are right now. Let me give a little sense, again, sorry to rush through this, a little sense of what this looks like. As I described, these schools do really different things. And these are 4 schools that, theoretically we will go and visit at some point in March. But we wanted to give a sense. We have Olympus Academy, and they really have pushed online and blended learning. They're an iLearn school. And they have really tried to basically go create individualized learning experiences. So each child essentially gets some degree of an IEP. This IEP defines where the student is going in their learning. Some of it is online, some of it is blended learning, some of it is internships and courses. They essentially have done that for every student in their school. TWILS, which is Young Women's Leadership School, is a school that has fully embraced mastery-based assessment and mastery-based competency. This is a 6 through 12 school, and they essentially have started moving towards this idea that students can take a course, and the second that they have mastered the subjects or the topics that are covered in that course, they essentially can move on to another course. So this fall, they had, a bunch of students start in Algebra 1. Some of those students are going to graduate from Algebra 1 in October because they've mastered the subject. Some are going to graduate in November. Some are going to graduate in April, and some are going to graduate in June. And as soon as you graduate, you can move on to the next subject. You can start Algebra 2 in November. So you can kind of move forward. This school is also interesting is that they really have started moving away from grade levels. There was some reason why all 6th graders are 11 years old or 12 years old, and that's the reason you're in 6th grade. I think we're starting to question that about whether that's the best subject. Like some students will master 6th grade standards when they're 14 years old, and some students will master it when they're 9 years old. And we want to be able to allow for students to be able to do that. And this school has really started, they're calling students kind of year 1, year 2, year 3, because they're essentially trying to eliminate this idea that like you're in 6th grade and this is your course load, you're in 7th grade, this is your course load. You're at the course load that is at the right instructional level for you as a student. And that's another school we'll go visit. The New York City iSchool, which is really our leader in virtual learning or virtual classes. This is a smaller high school, and they have partnered with other small high schools to create with the help of Cisco. I kind of call it Skype on steroids. It's essentially a classroom in which there is a Skype board similar to this. There's a teacher at essentially the iSchool, which is in Chelsea, in Manhattan, and they actually have students now in 2 different schools, one in the Bronx, one in Brooklyn. Essentially they have one teacher teaching about 30 kids, 10 of which are sitting in front of the teacher, 10 of which are in the Bronx, and 10 of which are in Brooklyn. And essentially they're doing virtual learning. It's actually really an interesting model that we'll, again, be able to see and look through it. And it's also great and has been great for some of our smaller schools. If you're a school with 300 kids or 400 kids, you maybe have 4 English teachers, 4 math teachers, 4 science teachers, but being able to offer the range of different AP courses, remedial courses, all different levels, it's really been a great model for some of our smaller schools. And then finally, another school we have is Wheels, this is a school that has basically really pushed the idea of putting the student at the center of instruction at all times. And essentially the students really lead their entire instructional program, from the curriculum they're getting to even things like parent-teacher conferences. The teacher doesn't really lead them anymore. The students really lead them. To basically all aspects of their school, it's really actually an amazing environment, are completely structured around the student. The student is generally leading this process for their entire school. But again, we'll go and look through some of these schools when we come in March. I threw in some data here just because I feel like it's hard to do a presentation without some data. I'm going to skip through it very quickly. But essentially, after a year, we have seen some improvement. This happens to be Wheels, although we could have taken any 4 of them. We have seen a lot of improvement in these schools. We need to do much more analysis to determine whether, some of the work that Wheels is doing is directly contributing to this, or there are other, factors. But generally, we have seen some pretty strong improvements after the first couple of years in ELA and math. So that's basically it. So this program essentially started with Arthur and 2 other people, the creation of the iZone. It is now about 80 people, essentially people that work, some in central office, some directly at school sites. And essentially, these are the areas we're essentially looking at supporting schools, which is guidance and implementation support. And we do this work both from our internal staff as well as bringing outside partners into this work. We essentially have what we call our design partners and our component partners. Some of those are actually people here. New Tech is one of our design partners. Each partner is essentially matched up with a school after a school is accepted to the iZone. And they kind of help the school do an analysis of where the school is, strengths, weaknesses, and then over the next 6 or 8 months, create basically a plan for the next 3 years for the school to move towards a more personalized environment. We also have component partners that are essentially working with the schools as well, along with the design partners, to help bring in new technologies to the schools. That kind of Skype on steroids. Cisco was one of our component partners for the iSchool, and they kind of helped the iSchool create this new model, which has been great, actually. It really wasn't something that Cisco had ever done before, but they'd done it, I think, in some other environments. They hadn't done it fully at a school level, but they essentially worked with the principal in that school community to bring it in. We do have field staff. Infrastructure has been a huge issue. Our buildings were, on average built in like 1930-something or 1940-something. So infrastructure is a challenge. All of our schools do not have wireless. There's a lot of schools that are not fully wired, partially because we can't get Time Warner and Comcast to get the wires out to the schools at a fast enough rate, and partially because schools don't have the wiring at the school to be able to support the amount of devices that they want to be able to use. So that's been a huge problem for us and a challenge. And then also kind of technology and what we call policy support. There are a lot of policies that New York City Department of Education has in place, that the state of New York has in place, and that to some degree the federal government has in place. And we, from the iZone perspective, have really worked hard to try to change some of these things. I feel like we've maybe touched at the fringes a little bit, but we need to get much more closely aligned to the center. New York has a policy right now that all students have to be in school for 180 days, and those 180 days need to be from September through June. I don't know why that's the case. I'm going to probably take some guesses and financial reasons and those kind of things, but a lot of our schools don't want to do that anymore. They don't want to have 180 days spread over 10 months. They want to do 180 days spread over 12 months. They want to do 200 days spread over 12 months. And so those are some of the policies that we've been trying to work with the state on trying to adapt. And we've had some success in some areas where we're just getting a lot of bureaucratic rules that get in the way. And some of our early outcomes, some of the pilot work and stuff, we have seen some very positive reports back from both teachers being engaged. Some early academic outcome data we've seen is very good. Actually, in the next about 2 weeks, we're going to be announcing some of our School of One data, which has been outstanding for this, the one school that's now been doing it for 2 years fully as a full program. But they really saw some incredible gains in the last 2 years, which is great. We essentially do school selection to get schools into the iZone. We allow schools to basically apply. They can apply to be part of either iLearn or iZone 360. And we essentially bring schools in, and we have huge amounts of schools that apply. I think we had about 400 schools that applied for about 200 slots last year. So we don't accept all schools into the iZone. And I can talk a little bit about why we accept some schools and not other schools. It's definitely not based on academic ability. We don't choose high-performing schools. It's really based on capacity of schools to embrace change and to build the case for change in their environment. But we can talk a little bit more about that. We also have started, the iZone is interesting. It's about 10% of schools, maybe about 12, 15% of schools in New York City. About 1,700 schools. We have about 260. And the idea with the iZone is that we were going to create a community that would allow people to be innovative. And then at some point, we're going to diffuse this to the system, that we were going to learn, here are 3 practices that really seem to be effective for schools, and we're going to try to bring it out to the other 1,700 schools, or at least the other 400 high schools. It's actually been a huge challenge for us. It's an area that we're really struggling with. Like, how do you take practices that a school has embraced and been engaged in for the last 2 years and really working hard to implement and going through all these challenges and say, hey, this is a more successful model. And the school down the street's like, hey, that's great that they're doing it. They're in the iZone. There's no way that practice would work in my school. And that's something we've really struggled with. We've created basically communities of practice. This used to be iZone only, but to allow other schools kind of their first entree into what some of the iZone work is. So some of our affinity groups or lab schools, they're essentially working with non-iZone schools to give these schools a sense of how they kind of move towards this. That's been a challenge. We also have some leadership council work, which is essentially teachers and principals at iZone schools that are essentially leading some of the direction of the iZone in general. Yeah. So that's actually exactly what we've been doing over here, which is essentially exactly what you described, which is essentially creating case studies to talk about how a school moved towards a 6 through 12 traditional school environment to a mastery-based learning environment. So we don't really have the things built yet, but essentially they should actually be coming out in the next month or two. Our communities of practice right now essentially are within New York City public schools, but actually we've gotten a lot of questions and a lot of people come visit the iZone. Actually, fortunately, in the new Race to the Top D grant, it actually has a supplemental section that allows you to apply to work with other districts. So we actually have created some loose partnerships with Chicago and Newark, but we're going to actually try to expand that out because we don't have all the answers in New York, and actually some other districts are doing some really innovative things. I think everyone here, well, not everyone here, a lot of people here went to Mooresville, and I was blown away by some of the stuff they were doing. We're in Houston. So we actually are really interested in learning from some other districts as well. And so we're going to try to do some more external-facing work outside of New York. Yeah, I would say that that's a pretty accurate statement. It's a pretty accurate statement. I would say that most of our stuff actually will be out in the next probably month or two. We essentially have a research team that's researching a lot of this to be able to document it and move it forward. But it's a good question. So this partner work, I cannot underestimate how important it is for us to work with partners. I really think the partners have allowed us actually to think differently. One thing that's been a real eye-opener for us is simply letting a school say, all right, you're in this community, and you can basically do whatever you want to do. And there are some schools, I think they're rare, that really can think innovatively and try to break out of the normal structure. But what we find is a lot of schools just basically are like, oh, great, now we can move lunch to make it be 30 minutes instead of 45 minutes. And that's like, this is something major we've been working on. We finally have gotten permission to do it. That's our innovation. And we really have struggled to figure out how to get schools to really think outside the box. Like, what are the policies, structures, and procedures that you can start questioning? The TWILS example I have, where they essentially are trying to eliminate this idea of 6 through 12, they're more of an extreme school that's pushing the limits. Most of our schools are not thinking that way. And I think the best way we've actually been able to schools to try to look differently is actually by bringing outside partners into our groups. New Tech, KED, Cisco, Apple, lots of groups coming inside, and we basically have tried to create structures to allow that to happen more rapidly than it normally did in New York. I can't tell you why there's such a big bureaucracy in New York and why it's so hard for outside partners to get in, but it is hard. I'm sure everyone here can give about 20 stories about trying to break in, but it's a hard process. In the iZone, I think we've done incrementally better job of trying to help outside groups come in and directly partner them with schools to be able to essentially think differently. But it's something that we absolutely feel is necessary. The other big thing we do, and the whole reason that we are part of this league, is that we truly believe that there are other districts in the US and actually around the world that are doing some of the things more effectively than we are. We have to learn from those places. And that's what the league has given us. It's introduced me and a lot of our team to a lot of different practices around the country. We're part of a group called GELP, which is the Global Education Leaders Program, and they have essentially opened us up to schools in Helsinki and Singapore and places around the world that have really, and we've brought a lot of their partners and their practices to New York, which has been great. This is pretty much where I'm going to stop my presentation, hopefully attempt to facilitate some sort of conversation here. But I want to list 3 of the biggest challenges that we have in New York as we kind of move forward. Number 1 is this idea of encouraging innovation in a system of autonomy. This is a really hard one. I mean, a school that says, hey, changing the lunch schedule, that's the innovation that we want to embrace. And we're telling schools, you're innovative, you're autonomous, you can do what we want. It actually causes us some challenges. We essentially have had to kick some schools out of the iZone because they said they were going to do X, and they really didn't. They moved like the dial maybe a half a notch when they said they were going to move it 3 notches. And that to us is not really the reason we're putting extra supports, resources, funding, time, effort into these schools. And that's been a really hard challenge for us. Schools say, hey, this is innovation in my school. This is what's going to help us. And that's been a hard challenge for us. Interested to see if other districts have that same challenge. Another one we're trying to figure out is that we have figured out mastery-based learning, I'd argue, is probably one of them. There are some things that seem to be really successful in our schools. How do we support rapid prototyping of them? So if we say mastery-based learning is a practice we want to support in a large number of our schools, how do we take it from 10 schools and essentially expand it out to 50 schools in the next 3 years, or take School of One and move from 4 or 5 schools to 50 schools in 3 years? That's been a huge challenge for us. We definitely have not figured out how to do that. And then finally is how do you get all levels of a school in a system to buy into innovation? We have enough schools in our system that they can say, well, great, the innovation is going on in the iZone. We're going to kind of do our own thing. Like there's a sense of, I got young principals, young teachers, those people really, they just graduated from college. They've been using, iPads since they were, since their first day of freshman year. But for my school and my traditional environment, there's no way I could do it. And that's not really the point of the iZone. The iZone was really to figure out which practices we could rapidly prototype and implement in the rest of the system because they were more effective. And that's been a huge challenge for us. So that's about it. Maybe I just open it up for some questions, and then maybe we can just have some conversation here.
Point of view. Do you have research partners?
Yeah, that's a great question.
Yeah, the question was, what is the research strategy and evaluation strategy, and does he have partners that iZone is working with on that?
Yeah, we have a small research team within the iZone. So that's been great. I think we have 3 researchers that are essentially doing a lot of what that first question was, which is essentially creating case studies to figure out how we support new iZone schools for coming in and making sure their success is a little bit, they can more rapidly implement some of these things. And essentially we have some outside partners that are doing it as well. We worked actually with Harvard Ed Labs on a PLS, a personalized learning system pilot that's been going on for the last 2 years in New York. So we essentially have worked with other groups. One is we work with outside groups. Columbia's come in, they're doing our research on School of One. Research Alliance has done some research with us. We essentially have brought other groups in. We have been very fortunate that other research groups actually have been able to get their own funding or do pro bono research for us, which has been great. We do have our own research team. We also created about a year ago what we call our Research Advisory Council. We essentially have gotten together with essentially leading researchers in the field of essentially personalization, and it goes in a variety of different areas, blended and online, some of the different areas we're talking about here. And we bring them in actually on a quarterly basis. We literally fly them into New York so that they can actually participate and help us figure out what our research is telling us, like really, like getting below, just a little chart on a board, but also like what other districts are doing and what their research around the country is showing us, because we do feel like that is a key part of where we're going and what we're figuring out. So.
Thank you.
I don't know how many people in this room about disrupting class, but one of the problems I think you're running into is definitional, because innovation is new and improved, and disruptive innovation is revolution. So, new and improved doesn't transform anything, and unless you're transforming things, then you're just doing more of the same and extending the lunch hour for 15 minutes or. But one specific question I have for you is that when you were describing, you run the terms online and blended together, could you explain what you mean by online blended?
Sure. Yeah, I do talk about, first of all, I talk about a mile a minute, so the fact that you even were able to differentiate between that I was saying that is actually impressive. First of all, in regard to your first comment, I really appreciate you saying that, and I wish I could have you come and speak in front of our principals in New York, because I think that has really been a challenge for us. And if other other school districts want to talk about that. It has been a challenge of like the difference between like we're getting things a little bit better, and like there's no question that some of the minor changes that they want to make, changes in schedule or the lunch period, they think of as a really good improvement for their school. But as you described, it's not disrupting the trajectory of the students in that environment to a much higher slope. And that's something we're struggling with. So we do, in terms of online and blended learning, we essentially have an online tool. It's called iLearn New York City. It's an online platform that students can go to and teachers can go to. Some of the courses there are blended learning. So you might have, if a class normally meets 5 days a week, you might meet 2.5 days a week, and then 2.5 days a week you're doing work at home. Like you're doing online work or you're doing assessments or you're actually interacting with students in school, but there's partial in-school environment and then partial out-of-school environment. We also have, that's one type of work that's going on. We also have online learning, which is essentially the students are not at any point in a classroom environment. They are entirely online. They spend all of their time, the amount of time in the class is spent on an online environment. So what
you really mean is online and blended.
Yes,
not online blended.
No, that's true. It's true. Yeah, some schools do it either way. And some teachers actually have some online courses and some blended learning. So it actually has been interesting. We're actually doing quite a bit of research now. We had a lot of AP courses. So a lot of schools said, hey, we want to get our kids more access to AP courses, either because they were small or they didn't offer them. And we're actually doing some research now to determine whether traditional AP courses, online AP courses, or blended learning AP courses get better or different outcomes, or if there's certain types of student characteristics that might lend themselves to student being more successful in one of those three environments. So, but yes, those are online and blended are two explicitly different areas.
David,
Yeah.
Can you give us a sense of the commitment in the district? And by that I mean the leadership at the highest levels. I mean, we've all been through lots of innovation in many districts, and the big question that I think that stops many teachers and many principals from getting on board is here today, gone tomorrow.
Yep.
So what have you done to address that issue about commitment?
Yeah.
Longevity, staying in it for the long term, expecting success, expecting failure, expecting rapid prototyping. In other words, really being in it to learn and to move forward.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it came in a couple of different ways. Joel Klein, when he was the chancellor in New York, was probably the biggest cheerleader for the iZone and for actually innovation. He was by far the biggest cheerleader. And I think that kind of, first of all, got us a lot of private support. It got us some private funding. It got us some outside partners that said, hey, this guy is serious about it. And it got schools at least interested in it. I think that was absolutely needed at that time in order to kind of like get a good kickoff. But I think the thing that has happened the most over the last 2 or 3 years, maybe even less time, maybe the last 18 months or 2 years, has been that we don't force schools into the iZone. We say to them, if you want to come in, these are the things you're going to have to do. And we're going to help you along the way. We're going to give you resources and supports. We struggle a little bit about their autonomy versus our influence. So I have to admit that's a struggle. But by the time the schools have gone through our process, they are bought in. I was talking with Dennis, who's the chancellor now, about this about 2 weeks ago. We had brought him out to a couple of iZone schools. And his basic analysis was, there's no way we could actually get the iZone out of these schools at this point. Like, they are so bought in and so deeply believe in this kind of change that, it's not possible to get them out at this point. So that's actually one thing that's been very positive. And I think that is a struggle for us in terms of like schools that are only making these minor improvements. They believe in it so much, and they're so deeply embedded, and the types of achievement, the types of change they're making are so incremental that it's been hard for us to say, how do we kind of move them out? Like, how do we say these types of changes are not good enough? And I think that's something that's been a struggle for us, and how to actually balance that. Do you want to weigh in on this one, or? So I don't want to put you on the spot there.
I think related to that, Linda, David's sustained commitment and leadership has been a big part of that, and seeing that continue. And I think a movement, as one of your slides had, to bring it into more of the core goals of the district. And so David working with the other deputy chancellors and Chancellor Walcott to understand how a personalized approach to instruction. I really like that you started with your data in the beginning, where yes, New York has gone from 43 to 63% growth, but a long way to go yet to get to, let's just say, 85. And so making a radical bet on personalized mastery-based learning as what's going to be transformative to rise to that level. And I think that's, understanding the context in New York as an empowerment district is, I think, what's so interesting about the iZone, that this is not a centrally driven program. It's not an implementation program, it's an innovation strategy. Yep. And so, as Damien suggested earlier, you're leading by vision, but you're expecting folks to come in and put skin in the game and own their own design and commitment to the innovation. And you'll bring these supports along. But if they're not doing that, then that's fine. We'll put these resources elsewhere. And so that ownership of the design, of the innovation, I think is fundamental to its being sustained. Jonathan, who was like the third member of the iZone.
We have a lot of iZone history here.
Add one piece to that.
Good.